The HOA crew arrived just after sunrise with a rented excavator, 2 sheriff's deputies, and a folded violation order taped to a clipboard. By noon, the old cedar fence behind Eleanor Whitaker's property was splintered into wet piles beside the ditch road. Most people in Bell County assumed the widow would simply watch from her porch and let it happen. She almost did. Until one of the workers uncovered a rusted iron survey marker buried beneath the fence line. Eleanor stared at it for a long time, then quietly walked back inside and unlocked a dust-covered county file nobody had opened since 1978. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the roads around Bell County coated in gray mud and tire grooves. By 7:30, the HOA trucks rolled slowly past the Whitaker property with their headlights still glowing against the fog. Most of the newer homes in Pine Hollow Estate sat clean and uniform behind trimmed hedges and decorative stone mailboxes. Eleanor Whitaker's property stood apart from all of them. The cedar fence behind her land leaned slightly toward the creek bed. The wood had darkened with age decades earlier. Moss climbed the lower boards. Half the posts were older than the subdivision itself. People called it ugly. Eleanor called it her husband's last completed project. She stood on the porch wearing a gray wool sweater, one hand wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold long ago. She didn't wave at the workers. Didn't protest. Didn't ask questions. That seemed to irritate Brent Holloway more than anger would have. Brent was president of the Pine Hollow HOA. Mid-40s. Pressed jacket. Expensive boots already ruined by mud. The kind of man who liked speaking through paperwork instead of conversation. You received 3 notices, he said while unfolding the clipboard. Eleanor nodded once. The structure violates updated creek visibility ordinances. Another nod. Brent glanced at the excavator operator. We're authorized to proceed. The machine lurched forward. Wood cracked sharply through the morning silence. A few neighbors gathered near the roadside to watch. Quiet spectators clutching travel mugs and umbrellas. Someone whispered that Eleanor should have sold years ago. Someone else said the HOA had been trying to force her out since the developers purchased the adjoining farmland. Eleanor said nothing. But she watched carefully. Every broken board. Every exposed nail. Every scoop of wet earth lifted beside the creek bank. Near noon, the excavator bucket scraped against metal underground. The operator stopped immediately. A dull iron spike protruded from the mud beside the ruined fence line. One of the younger workers climbed down into the trench and brushed dirt away with his glove. Survey marker, he muttered. Brent frowned. Ignore it. But Eleanor's expression changed for the first time all morning. Not anger. Recognition. She stepped off the porch slowly and walked toward the trench with measured steps, stopping several feet short of the exposed marker. The worker looked at her. You know what this is? Eleanor stared quietly at the rusted iron cap. My husband spent 6 months looking for that. Brent sighed impatiently. It's irrelevant. Eleanor finally looked directly at him. That depends where the original county line was placed. The sentence landed strangely in the silence. Too calm. Too specific. Brent forced a smile. The county already approved our development maps. Eleanor nodded again like she expected that answer. Then she turned around and walked back toward the house without another word. The workers resumed tearing apart the fence, but the mood had shifted. Even the deputies seemed uneasy now. Inside the house, Eleanor crossed the narrow hallway and entered a back room lined with filing cabinets, stacked notebooks, and faded survey maps rolled into cardboard tubes. A tea kettle whistled softly in the kitchen. She ignored it. Instead, she knelt beside an old cedar chest and lifted out a thick county archive file covered in dust. Across the tab, handwritten in fading ink, were 4 words. Whitaker Creek Easement Dispute, 1978. Eleanor carried the file to the kitchen table carefully, like something fragile had finally returned home. The Whitaker file smelled faintly of mildew and old paper. Eleanor placed it carefully beside the kitchen lamp while rainwater ticked softly from the porch gutters outside. The house remained silent except for the tea kettle cooling on the stove and the distant growl of machinery still working behind the property. She opened the folder slowly. Inside were decades of folded surveys, handwritten notes, tax receipts, zoning correspondence, and yellow carbon copies stamped by the Bell County Planning Office. Most people would have seen clutter. Eleanor saw a timeline. Her late husband, Walter Whitaker, had organized everything meticulously before his death 8 years earlier. Dates written in blue ink. Property corners marked in pencil. References to creek shifts, floodplain revisions, and easement disputes stretching back to the late 1970s. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and unfolded the oldest survey map. There it was again. The iron marker. Documented officially in 1978 as Boundary Monument 14C. She stared at the notation for a long time. Outside, another section of fence collapsed. Eleanor reached for Walter's notebook beside the file. The leather cover had cracked with age. Several pages near the center were marked with strips of faded masking tape. One entry stopped her immediately. If the marker is ever uncovered again, the county maps collapse with it. No explanation beneath it. Just that sentence. Eleanor closed the notebook halfway and leaned back quietly. For years, Walter had insisted the subdivision developers made a mistake during the original land consolidation process. Nobody listened. The county approved the plats anyway. The HOA expanded. New homes appeared along the creek. Property values climbed. Walter died before proving anything. Most people assumed the argument died with him. But Eleanor remembered every night he spent at this same kitchen table comparing county surveys beneath yellow lamp light while coffee turned cold beside his elbow. And now the marker had resurfaced. At 1:30 that afternoon, Eleanor drove into town in her aging Buick sedan. She parked outside the Bell County Records office, a squat brick building that smelled permanently of wet cardboard and dust. The clerk at the front desk recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Whitaker. I need archive access." The younger clerk hesitated. "Older than what year?" 1978. That earned a glance. Archive retrievals took effort. Most people never requested them. The clerk disappeared through a back hallway while Eleanor waited beside a flickering vending machine. A sheriff's deputy walked through carrying permit folders. Two surveyors argued quietly near the copier room. Normal county business. But 20 minutes later, the clerk returned looking uncomfortable. "There's a restriction note attached to the Whitaker consolidation records." Eleanor remained still. "What kind of restriction?" "Administrative hold request from Holloway Development Group." The name settled heavily in the air. Brent Holloway's family company. The clerk lowered her voice. "It says access requests require county legal review first." Eleanor looked toward the archive hallway. "When was the restriction filed?" The clerk checked again. 3 years ago. That mattered. Because the subdivision expansion proposal had also begun 3 years earlier. Eleanor nodded once, calm as ever. "Then I'd like the filing date and authorization signature." The clerk hesitated again. "That part one can print." Minutes later, Eleanor walked out carrying a single sheet of paper folded neatly inside her coat pocket. Not proof. Not yet. But enough to confirm something Walter suspected before he died. Someone had buried the old records intentionally. And now the fence demolition had exposed something they thought would stay underground forever. Back at Pine Hollow Estates, Brent Holloway stood near the destroyed fence line speaking urgently into his phone while workers loaded cedar debris into dumpsters. One of the deputies pointed toward Eleanor's empty property. She went into town. Brent's jaw tightened slightly. For the first time all day, he looked genuinely concerned. By the following morning, the remains of the cedar fence were gone. Only splintered roots of old posts remained along the creek bank, sticking from the mud like broken teeth. Fresh tire tracks carved deep grooves through Eleanor's backyard where the excavator had passed. The HOA workers were gone now, replaced by temporary orange stakes marking future landscaping plans for the subdivision's expansion path. Someone had already placed a printed notice near the roadside. Pine Hollow Creek Restoration Project. Eleanor read it without expression while sipping black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. Then she folded the notice once and placed it inside Walter's notebook. The same notebook she had barely slept beside all night. At dawn, she reopened it beneath the kitchen lamp and continued reading pages she had not touched in years. Walter's handwriting became more frantic near the final entries. Less organized. More suspicious. Dates circled repeatedly. County permit numbers. Hand-drawn diagrams of the creek bed. And one phrase repeated 3 separate times. Check the flood revision filing. Eleanor finally found what he meant inside a sealed envelope taped near the back cover. Inside was a receipt from Bell County Survey records dated October 14, 1981. Attached to it was a handwritten note from Walter. They moved the water boundary after approval. Eleanor stared at the sentence quietly. Under county law, creek boundaries determine setback ownership, utility access, and easement control. If the original creek line had been altered improperly after development approval, portions of Pine Hollow estates might legally sit on disputed land. Not stolen land. Worse. Unstable permits. That could freeze expansion projects entirely. By mid-morning, Eleanor drove to the Bell County Public Library. The building sat across from the old courthouse square, nearly empty except for retirees reading newspapers and 2 college students working near the archives section. Margaret Bell, the head librarian, recognized Eleanor instantly. "Haven't seen you in a while." Eleanor placed the folded receipt on the desk. "I need county floodplain revisions from 1980 through 1983. Margaret adjusted her glasses slowly. "That far back usually means microfilm." "That's fine." The librarian studied Eleanor for a moment before nodding toward the archive room downstairs. The basement smelled like dust, machine oil, and old paper bindings. Eleanor spent nearly 3 hours feeding reels through the microfilm reader while handwritten notes accumulated beside her coffee cup. Most of the records were routine. Then she found it. Bell County Floodplain Amendment, April 1981. Approved quietly during a closed infrastructure review session. No public hearing listed. No attached environmental survey. And most importantly, the amended creek boundary shifted exactly 11 feet eastward near the Whitaker property line. 11 feet. Enough to reposition the subdivision access corridor. Enough to erase the original survey marker from future plats. Enough to make the HOA expansion possible. Eleanor copied everything carefully. No excitement crossed her face. Only confirmation. When she returned upstairs, Margaret noticed the stack of copies under Eleanor's arm. "You find something?" Eleanor paused. "Maybe my husband wasn't wrong." The librarian leaned slightly closer. "About the developers?" Eleanor folded the papers neatly. "About someone changing county records after approval." That sentence lingered between them heavily. Because in Bell County, land disputes weren't unusual. But altered county filings were something else entirely. Outside, clouds rolled low across the square while construction trucks moved steadily toward Pine Hollow Estates. Back at the subdivision office, Brent Holloway sat in a glass conference room reviewing expansion permits when his assistant entered quietly. "There's an issue." Brent didn't look up. "What now?" She requested floodplain archives. That got his attention. His eyes lifted slowly from the paperwork. "Who told you?" County clerk called Nathan in legal. Silence settled across the room. Brent stood and walked toward the window overlooking the development site beyond the trees. The old fence was gone. But somehow the situation already felt worse. Much worse. Because Eleanor Whitaker wasn't reacting emotionally. She was following records. And Brent suddenly realized something dangerous. People who panic can be managed. Patient people usually cannot. 3 days after the fence came down, a black SUV appeared at the end of Eleanor Whitaker's gravel driveway just before sunset. The vehicle stayed parked for nearly a minute before the driver stepped out carefully, avoiding puddles left behind by another evening storm. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window while steam rose quietly from a kettle behind her. The man approaching the porch wore a navy overcoat despite the humidity. Mid-50s. Clean haircut. Leather briefcase. Not local. Attorney. Eleanor already knew before he introduced himself. Daniel Mercer, he said politely when she opened the screen door halfway. I represent Pine Hollow Development Holdings. Not the HOA. The parent company. That mattered. Eleanor waited silently. Mercer offered a restrained smile. May I come in? She stepped aside without answering. The kitchen remained exactly as Walter left it years earlier. Old oak table. County maps stacked neatly beside notebooks. Filing cabinets lining the wall near the laundry room. Mercer noticed everything immediately. Especially the open survey copies. His expression tightened almost invisibly. Eleanor poured hot water into 2 plain ceramic cups and sat across from him without ceremony. Mercer placed a folder gently on the table. My clients would prefer to resolve any misunderstandings privately. Eleanor glanced at the folder but didn't touch it. Misunderstandings about what? Mercer folded his hands carefully. The fence demolition created unnecessary tension. Pine Hollow is prepared to compensate you fairly. Compensate. Interesting word choice. Not reimburse. Not apologize. Compensate. Eleanor finally opened the folder. Inside was a formal settlement proposal offering $80,000 for voluntary transfer of the disputed creekside strip behind her property. Far above market value. Which meant the land itself probably wasn't the real concern. Mercer continued calmly. You'd retain your home and acreage. This simply resolves the access corridor issue. Eleanor looked up slowly. I haven't mentioned an access corridor. Mercer paused. Very briefly. But long enough. Outside, rain tapped softly against the porch roof while the kitchen clock ticked in steady rhythm beside Walter's old notebook. Eleanor slid the settlement papers back across the table untouched. My husband spent 22 years arguing about those county revisions. Mercer exhaled lightly. With respect, Mrs. Whitaker, these matters become expensive quickly. That sounds expensive already. Another pause. The attorney studied her differently now. Less like an elderly widow. More like a witness who already understood too much. Mercer softened his tone. The development employs hundreds of people locally. If expansion stalls over outdated survey concerns, then your investors become nervous. The sentence interrupted him quietly. Not aggressive. Just precise. Mercer stopped speaking altogether. Eleanor reached for Walter's notebook and opened to the page containing the floodplain references. I visited the library yesterday. That landed harder than she expected. Mercer's eyes moved immediately toward the notebook. Not panic. But calculation. You found old records, he said carefully. I found missing procedures. Silence spread slowly through the kitchen. The tea kettle clicked softly as the metal cooled. Mercer leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Whitaker, county amendments from 40 years ago are complicated matters. Eleanor nodded. They are when hearing records disappear. That changed the room completely. Because now she wasn't suggesting clerical mistakes. She was implying intentional concealment. Mercer closed the folder slowly. My clients are willing to increase the offer. There's no offer yet. He frowned slightly. You haven't named a number. Eleanor looked toward the dark creek beyond the window. This stopped being about money when they dug up that marker. For the first time since arriving, Mercer seemed unsure what to say next. He stood carefully and gathered the folder back into his briefcase. Before leaving, he paused near the doorway. You should understand something, he said quietly. Large projects don't stop easily. Eleanor folded Walter's receipt back into the notebook. No, she replied softly. But permits do. Mercer said nothing after that. His SUV disappeared down the gravel road minutes later beneath steady rain and low headlights. Eleanor remained alone at the kitchen table long after dark, reviewing county copies beneath the lamp while coffee cooled untouched beside her elbow. Near midnight, she opened the final drawer of Walter's filing cabinet. Inside rested a sealed brown envelope labeled in faded handwriting. For county review only. Eleanor stared at it for a very long time before finally reaching for it. The envelope had yellowed with age. Eleanor carried it carefully to the kitchen table while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the creek valley. The house felt smaller at night, quieter. Every sound stood alone, the refrigerator humming, rain tapping against the windows, pages shifting beneath her fingertips. Walter's handwriting stretched across the front in block letters. For county review only, hold until necessary. She opened it slowly. Inside were photocopies, handwritten calculations, and one cassette tape sealed in a plastic evidence sleeve. Eleanor stared at the tape first. 1982 planning session. Her pulse quickened slightly for the first time in days. Walter used to attend county infrastructure meetings carrying a small recorder in his coat pocket whenever officials refused written clarification. Back then, nobody thought much about it. Half the farmers in Bell County documented meetings because land disputes often became memory contests years later. Eleanor set the tape aside carefully and continued reading. Several pages contained side-by-side comparisons of creek surveys before and after the 1981 amendment. Walter had marked discrepancies in red pencil. Distances changed. Easement measurements shifted. One utility corridor appeared entirely rerouted. But the final document mattered most. A typed internal memo from Holloway Development Holdings. Unsigned. Undated. Yet unmistakably authentic. Floodplain adjustment required before investor review. Eleanor read the sentence twice. Then 3 times. Not proof of fraud. But proof the floodplain shift was financially necessary before expansion approval. That changed motive. And motive changed everything. At 9 the next morning, Eleanor drove to the office of Harold Finch, a semi-retired property attorney operating above an old hardware store near the courthouse square. Finch had known Walter for decades. The office smelled like dust, coffee grounds, and aging legal books. Harold adjusted his suspenders while reviewing the documents silently. He spoke only after nearly 20 minutes. You understand what this could trigger? Eleanor nodded once. Permit suspension. Potentially every permit tied to the amended boundary. Harold removed his glasses slowly. If these records hold up, Pine Hollow may have expanded using invalid floodplain assumptions for 40 years. Neither spoke for a moment. Rain streaked softly across the office windows overlooking Main Street. Finally Harold pointed toward the cassette tape. What's on that? I haven't listened yet. You should. Eleanor looked toward the old tape recorder sitting beneath Harold's bookshelf. He noticed immediately. You want to hear it now? It wasn't a question. Minutes later, static crackled through the tiny speaker as the tape began turning. Voices emerged slowly beneath background noise, papers moving, chairs scraping, low conversation. Then a clear voice cut through the distortion. Brent Holloway's father. Young then. Confident. Once the creek revision passes, the Whitaker objection becomes irrelevant. Another voice answered nervously. Only if the marker stays buried. Silence filled Harold's office. The tape continued rolling. Someone laughed quietly in the background. Then another sentence. The county won't reopen surveys after approval anyway. Harold stopped the recorder immediately. Neither moved. Outside, a delivery truck rattled past the courthouse. Finally Harold leaned back heavily in his chair. That, he said quietly, is a very serious recording. Eleanor stared at the cassette. Walter had kept it hidden for over 40 years. Not released publicly. Not used in court. Saved. Waiting. Harold folded his hands carefully. Why didn't Walter file this? Eleanor answered without hesitation. He thought nobody would believe him without the original marker. And now the marker had resurfaced. By late afternoon, legal notices began quietly circulating through Bell County offices. Harold filed a formal request for emergency review of Pine Hollow's creek expansion permits pending boundary verification. Nothing public yet. But enough to start procedural alarms. At 6:30, Brent Holloway received the notice by email while standing inside the subdivision sales office. He read the document once. Then again. His face lost color gradually. Because at the very bottom of the filing, attached as supporting evidence, sat one sentence that changed everything. Original survey monument recovered on disputed easement line. The trap Walter Whitaker set decades earlier had finally closed. And Brent realized too late the quiet widow living behind the old cedar fence had never been fighting emotionally. She'd been waiting procedurally. Bell County Courthouse filled quietly the following Tuesday morning. Not with reporters or television crews. Nothing dramatic like that. Mostly surveyors, county attorneys, permit officials, and a handful of Pine Hollow residents who sensed something serious had begun moving beneath the surface of the subdivision dispute. Rain clouds pressed low above the square while people carried damp folders through the courthouse doors. Eleanor Whitaker arrived alone. Gray sweater. Leather notebook. Walter's county file held carefully beneath one arm. No performance. No anger. Just preparation. Inside hearing room B, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above rows of folding chairs. Brent Holloway sat beside two attorneys near the front table, speaking in restrained whispers while stacks of permit binders surrounded them. He stopped talking when Eleanor entered. For the first time since the fence demolition, he looked tired. The emergency review hearing itself remained procedural and painfully technical. County engineers discussed floodplain amendments. Surveyors compared easement measurements. Attorneys debated whether the original monument location invalidated later creek adjustments. Most people in the room barely understood half the terminology. But everyone understood tension. Because every new document seemed to deepen the same problem. The 1981 amendment lacked procedural hearing records. The revised floodplain survey lacked environmental certification. And the recovered iron marker aligned almost perfectly with Walter Whitaker's original boundary objections from decades earlier. Harold Finch spoke calmly through all of it. No theatrics. No accusations. Only records. Dates. Maps. Measurements. Then he introduced the cassette tape. Brent's attorney objected immediately. Harold responded just as quietly. We are not introducing criminal allegations. Only evidence of prior knowledge regarding disputed survey placement. Only records. Dates. Maps. Measurements. Then he introduced the cassette tape. Brent's attorney objected immediately. Harold responded just as quietly. We are not introducing criminal allegations. Only evidence of prior knowledge regarding disputed survey placement. The hearing officer allowed limited review. Static crackled softly through the courtroom speakers. Then the old voices returned. Once the creek revision passes, the Whitaker objection becomes irrelevant. A long silence followed after the tape ended. Nobody looked at Eleanor. Most looked at Brent. The hearing officer removed his glasses slowly and reviewed several pages before speaking. Pending full investigation, he said carefully, all active expansion permits associated with the Eastern Pine Hollow corridor are hereby suspended. No shouting followed. No gasps. Just stillness. Because everyone in the room understood the financial weight behind that sentence. Millions of dollars. Frozen instantly. Brent leaned back in his chair slowly while one attorney whispered urgently beside him. Across the room, county officials began exchanging folders with visible concern. The suspension wasn't final victory yet. But it was enough. Enough to stop construction. Enough to trigger investor review. Enough to reopen 40 years of buried records. Outside, rain began falling harder across the courthouse steps. Eleanor exited quietly through the side hallway before most people even stood up. Harold caught up with her beneath the awning near the parking lot. You realize they'll try settling now. Eleanor nodded. They already tried. Harold looked toward the courthouse windows. You could probably ask for anything. That almost made her smile. Almost. Instead, She opened Walter's notebook one final time and removed the original 1978 property survey. Raindrops tapped softly against the paper while she studied the faded boundary lines. "My husband didn't want money," she said. Harold waited. He wanted the county map corrected. Across town, Pine Hollow construction crews were already receiving stop work notices. Temporary fencing surrounded the unfinished creek corridor. Investors were calling emergency meetings. And somewhere beneath wet earth behind Eleanor's property, the recovered iron survey marker remained exactly where Walter Whitaker always said it would be. Still holding the original line. Still waiting quietly underground while generations of powerful people built around it pretending it no longer mattered. That evening, Eleanor returned home as sunset faded through the trees behind the creek bed. She carried Walter's notebook onto the back porch and sat beside the empty space where the cedar fence once stood. The land looked strange without it. Open. Exposed. But peaceful. She poured herself a fresh cup of coffee and listened to the creek moving through the dark while county trucks removed Pine Hollow's expansion stakes one by one in the distance. No celebration came. No triumphant speech. Only the soft sound of rainwater moving past the restored boundary line Walter Whitaker had protected for 40 years. And finally, quietly, the county had listened. 2 weeks later, Bell County approved the official correction order. The revised creek boundary was restored to the original 1978 survey position, and every future expansion permit tied to the eastern corridor was suspended pending full environmental review. Pine Hollow Development Holdings withdrew 3 active construction proposals before the investigation could widen further. Most people in town treated the story like a cautionary rumor. Quiet widow. Old survey marker. 40-year paperwork mistake. But inside county offices, filing cabinets were being reopened carefully now. Archived permits once ignored were suddenly reviewed twice. Clerks who barely remembered Walter Whitaker's complaints began speaking his name with uncomfortable respect. Eleanor never attended another hearing. She stayed home. Most mornings, she sat on the porch beside the creek with Walter's notebook resting unopened in her lap while workers installed temporary county markers near the restored line. No one from the HOA came near her property anymore. Not even Brent Holloway. The final settlement letter arrived on a gray Thursday afternoon. Delivered by certified mail. Harold Finch called an hour later. "You should read page 4 carefully." Eleanor did. Pine Hollow offered full reimbursement for fence damages, legal fees, property reassessment adjustments, and permanent withdrawal from all access claims tied to the Whitaker boundary. No admission of wrongdoing. But enough. At the bottom sat Brent Holloway's signature. Small. Compressed. Almost hurried. Eleanor folded the papers neatly and placed them inside Walter's old county file beside the original survey map. Then she opened his notebook one final time. Near the back, beneath pages of measurements and legal references, Walter had written a short entry dated only 3 months before his death. "If the marker returns, don't argue with them. Let the records argue instead." Eleanor read the sentence twice while evening light faded across the kitchen floor. Outside, the creek moved steadily beyond the empty fence line where cedar boards once stood. She closed the notebook gently. And for the first time in many years, the house no longer felt like it was waiting for someone to come home.